The snow of the Wyoming Territory held no respect for the aristocratic bloodline of the Vance family, nor did it offer a shred of mercy to a daughter thrown out like butchered offal. The heavy oak door of the manor slammed shut, the booming echo swallowed instantly by the howling gale. Eleanor Vance landed hard on the frozen mud of the courtyard, her palms scraping raw against jagged ice. Above her, standing on the expansive veranda of the home her father built with his own 2 hands, was Uncle Elias. He looked down upon her with eyes as cold and flat as hammered lead, wrapping her father's thick bearskin coat tightly around his own shoulders. Elias had planned the usurpation with the meticulous cruelty of a snake swallowing a nest of eggs. Only a week had passed since Arthur Vance, a man of iron constitution who had tamed 10,000 acres of wild frontier, succumbed to a sudden, violent illness. Eleanor still remembered the horrific spasms that racked his body, and the faint, unmistakable metallic scent of bitter almonds lingering in his final cup of evening tea. She knew it was murder. Elias knew she knew. Yet, power in the West belonged to the man holding the ledger and the local magistrate's ear. Elias had produced forged letters, masterfully penned to suggest Eleanor suffered from severe hysteria and harbored dangerous, treasonous intent against the expanding territorial government. A swift, quiet ruling by a corrupt judge was all it took to strip her of her birthright. The grand estate, the thousands of head of cattle, the lucrative railroad right-of-ways, all of it fell to Elias. She was deemed a madwoman, unfit to inherit, unfit to manage the empire, and ultimately, unfit to remain indoors. "Walk off the property, Eleanor," Elias commanded, his voice barely carrying over the shrieking wind. "If my men find you within a mile of the fence line by nightfall, they have orders to shoot a trespassing lunatic." Eleanor pushed herself to her knees. Her lungs burned with every breath of the sub-zero air. She wore only a simple woolen morning dress and a thin riding cloak she had managed to snatch before the hired muscle dragged her down the stairs. No boots, just indoor leather slippers, no provisions, no weapon. It was a death sentence delivered without the mercy of a rope. She did not weep. The shock of the betrayal burned too fiercely in her chest to allow for tears, and any moisture on her face would freeze her eyelashes together within minutes. She pulled the cloak tightly around her trembling shoulders, locked her jaw against the chattering of her teeth, and turned her back on the only world she had ever known. Behind her, the warm glow of the oil lamp spilled from the manor windows, a mocking reminder of the life stolen from her. The first mile was a haze of numb disbelief. The great Wyoming plains stretched out before her in a terrifying expanse of white and gray, a canvas of absolute desolation. The wind did not merely blow, it assaulted her. It was an invisible predator tearing at her garments and biting deeply into her unprotected flesh. By the second mile, the thin leather of her slippers had soaked entirely through, the freezing slush hardening into blocks of ice around her feet. The survival instinct, buried deep beneath years of finishing schools, fine literature, and parlor room pleasantries, began to claw its way to the surface. She was a Vance, born of the pioneers who had conquered this savage land. Her blood was the same blood that had bled onto this very soil to claim it, and she would not perish as a convenient footnote to Elias's towering greed. Yet, the bitter cold was an uncompromising executioner. As the afternoon sun vanished behind a thick bank of bruised, iron-colored clouds, the temperature plummeted drastically. The landscape transformed into a hostile, alien world where every shadow stretched like a stalking wolf and every snowdrift presented a potential, icy grave. Hunger gnawed at her belly, a dull, hollow ache that competed with the sharp, stabbing pain of frostbite creeping up her legs and arms. She kept her head down, leaning into the gale, focusing entirely on the monumental task of placing one agonizing footstep in front of the other. Her mind raced to keep itself awake, replaying the chaotic events of the past week. She needed to understand the true depth of Elias's conspiracy. He was a cunning man, but a coward at heart. He could not have managed the magistrate, the forged documents, and the arrival of heavily armed thugs on his own. There were deeper pockets and darker motives at play, a financial rot that extended far beyond the boundaries of the Vance estate. If she perished in the snow, the truth of her father's assassination would freeze eternally with her. That singular, burning desire for retribution became her internal furnace. Night descended with a swift, brutal finality. The temperature dropped so severely that the pine trees around her began to groan and pop loudly, their internal sap freezing solid and expanding. Eleanor stumbled, her deadened foot catching on a submerged, frozen root, and she crashed heavily into a deep snowbank. For a long, highly dangerous moment, she considered simply closing her eyes. The snow felt almost warm now, a deceptive, inviting blanket promising an immediate end to the relentless agony. Sleep would be so remarkably easy. The pain was fading, replaced by a heavy, lethargic peace. But a massive, jagged silhouette rising against the darkened, starless horizon forced her eyes open. It was the gaping maw of Blackwood Canyon. Locals spoke of the canyon only in hushed, fearful tones around saloon fires. It was a treacherous labyrinth of sharp ravines, unstable rockfalls, and twisting, sunless caverns. It was a place where cattle vanished without a trace and desperate outlaws disappeared, swallowed whole by the earth itself. It was the absolute last place a civilized woman should seek refuge. It was also the only geographical barrier that could offer a shield against the murderous prairie wind. Eleanor forced herself upright, her frozen joints screaming in rigid protest. The flesh of her face felt remarkably tight, stretched over her cheekbones like cured parchment. She dragged her ruined feet toward the towering, imposing rock formations. The entrance to the canyon was a narrow, jagged fissure, acting as a natural wind tunnel that blasted her with needle-sharp ice as she approached. She fought her way through the opening, the oppressive darkness of the stone walls enveloping her instantly. The deafening roar of the prairie wind immediately dulled to a low, menacing moan as she ventured deeper into the stone corridor. The towering canyon walls blocked out what little ambient light existed, leaving her to navigate entirely by touch. Her bare, freezing hands ran along the jagged sandstone, leaving invisible smears of blood from her cracked skin against the rock. The canyon smelled of ancient dust, damp earth, and something sharply metallic. She desperately needed to find an overhang, a shallow cave, any small recess that could trap the meager heat still radiating from her failing core. She moved blindly, the darkness absolute and suffocating. The uneven ground twisted her ankles, and exhaustion weighed upon her shoulders like a yoke of solid iron. Every rational instinct screamed at her to stop moving, to lay down, but the fire of vengeance demanded she keep breathing. Suddenly, her foot struck something soft but unyielding. Eleanor gasped, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, a sudden rush of adrenaline cutting through the freezing lethargy. She scrambled backward, her hands sinking into the freezing dirt of the canyon floor. It was not a rock. It was not a piece of fallen timber. In the pitch black of the cavernous passage, she had tripped over a mass that absolutely did not belong in the frozen wilderness. She strained her eyes, but the heavy darkness offered no answers. The sharp, metallic scent she had noticed earlier was overwhelmingly strong right here. Blood, fresh, heavy blood. What manner of beast or man lay bleeding out in the deepest heart of Blackwood Canyon? And would this desperate sanctuary ultimately become her execution chamber? A warm, sticky dampness against the freezing stone was the only warning Eleanor had before her hands found the shape of a dying man. She recoiled violently, her breath hitching in a raw throat as her frozen fingers registered the heavy, stiff wool of a coat and the unmistakable, viscous pooling of fresh blood. The wind howled with a demonic fury outside the narrow canyon walls, a relentless force seeking to freeze the very marrow in her bones. Yet, within this shallow, rocky alcove, the roar was muffled into a distant, angry drone, leaving behind a silence broken only by the wet, ragged rasp of a stranger's failing lungs. Panic, sharp and icy, warred with a sudden, ruthless pragmatism born of sheer desperation. The man was undoubtedly dying. His breathing was shallow, a bubbling gasp that spoke of pierced flesh and shattered bone. Her hands, devoid of all feeling, blindly mapped his form in the pitch black. He carried a heavy leather saddlebag, a thick canvas bedroll strapped tight, and, judging by the heavy iron bulk at his hip, a firearm. The aristocratic daughter of Arthur Vance, raised on fine lace and polite society, would have fled back into the storm, seeking the mythical safety of the local constabulary. But the exiled, freezing woman of the Wyoming wilderness, cast aside by her own blood, knew a terrifying truth: the dead needed no blankets, and the living required heat to survive the night. Her trembling hands patted down his heavy coat, seeking a matchbox, a flint, anything to banish the oppressive dark. She found a small tin tucked deep in a breast pocket, with numb, clumsy fingers that felt like blocks of wood. She struck a sulfur match against the cavern wall. The sudden flare of brilliant yellow light banished the absolute dark, illuminating a natural depression in the rock face that offered a meager sanctuary from the biting gale. It also illuminated the face of the man bleeding out at her feet. Eleanor gasped, the match nearly slipping from her grasp. Even beneath the heavy grit, the sweat of agony, and the deathly pallor of profound blood loss, the harsh, angular features were instantly recognizable. It was Silas Thorne. His face had been plastered on every telegraph pole, post office, and saloon door from Cross Creek to Cheyenne. A former Union cavalryman, the wanted posters proclaimed him a ruthless bandit, a cold-blooded murderer, and a train robber with a staggering $5,000 bounty on his head. Now, the infamous outlaw lay crumpled in the dirt like discarded rags, a massive, dark stain spreading rapidly across the right side of his rib cage. Someone had nearly collected the grand prize. Who had managed to bring down the notorious ghost of the plains? And were those unseen hunters currently tracking his heavy blood trail through the blinding snow? The match burned down to her fingertips, searing her skin and plunging them back into the suffocating darkness. She bit her lip against the pain and struck another, quickly locating a small, unlit pile of dry kindling and a kerosene lantern tucked safely near his saddle. She brought the lantern to life, casting a warm, flickering, amber glow over the grim scene. Eleanor knelt beside the infamous outlaw. Her own survival was precariously tied to this small alcove and the provisions within it. She could easily take his heavy coat, his fire, his rations, and leave him to the eternal mercy of the frost. In this untamed land, it would be an act of simple survival. Yet, the memory of her father's lifeless, staring eyes flashed unbidden in her mind. Elias had chosen murder for convenience, treating human life as an obstacle to his towering greed. If she allowed this man to die simply to strip the coat from his back and avoid the trouble of his survival, she was no better than the treacherous uncle who had cast her into the storm. She refused to let Elias turn her into a monster. She steeled her jaw, pushing aside the lingering remnants of her sheltered upbringing and the screaming pain in her own frost-bitten extremities. She unbuttoned his heavy, blood-soaked coat and tore away the ruined linen of his shirt. The bullet had entered just below his collarbone, tearing a ragged, ugly hole through muscle and tissue, but thankfully missing the lung. The lead was still lodged deep inside, a dark, poison seed in his flesh, working with a frantic, deeply focused energy. She rummaged blindly through his leather saddlebags. She found a heavy canteen filled with cheap, stinging rye whiskey, a roll of relatively clean cotton bandages, and a long, heavy hunting knife with a bone handle. The medical procedure was brutal and entirely devoid of the sanitized, quiet grace she had been taught in Eastern finishing schools. She poured the raw, biting alcohol directly into the open wound. Silas did not wake, but his rugged body seized violently in the dirt, a low, guttural moan of pure agony vibrating deep in his chest. Eleanor gritted her teeth, holding his shoulder down while she sterilized the blade of the knife directly in the lantern's open flame until the steel began to change color. She had assisted the estate's veterinarian with foaling difficult horses and mending barbed wire tears on cattle. But digging lead from human flesh was a horrifying, intimate graduation. She braced her knee firmly against his uninjured shoulder to keep him as still as possible, probing the ruined, slick tissue with a heated blade. The smell of scorched copper and hot, metallic blood filled the small enclosure, a nauseating stench that threatened to empty her already hollow, cramping stomach. Her fingers slipped on the slick muscle, the blood coating her hands like dark oil. But finally, the tip of the hot blade scraped against the deformed, solid lump of lead. With a sickening twist and a sharp, forceful pull, the bloody slug popped free, clattering heavily onto the stone floor. She quickly packed the weeping wound with the clean cotton, binding it tightly across his broad chest with long strips torn hastily from her own woolen petticoat, knotting the fabric with bloody, uncontrollably trembling hands. Exhausted and physically spent, Eleanor collapsed back against the cold cave wall. She fed the small fire with the remaining kindling, the meager, desperate heat slowly thawing the ice in her hair and the agonizing numbness in her fingers and toes. She wrapped Silas's heavy canvas bedroll around her own shivering shoulders, keeping her weary eyes fixed unwaveringly on the unconscious outlaw. Hours bled into the deep, unforgiving night. The howling of the blizzard outside seemed to distance itself, replaced by the comforting crackle of the fire and the steady, drastically improved rhythm of Silas's breathing. He was strong. The color was faintly returning to his ashen cheeks. Then, the rhythm changed. A sudden, sharp intake of breath shattered the quiet intimacy of the cave. Silas's eyes snapped open. They were the color of bruised storm clouds, wide, feral, and deeply clouded with the agonizing haze of a rising fever. Before Eleanor could even formulate a word of reassurance, the outlaw moved with a terrifying, coiled speed that defied his catastrophic injuries. Despite his profound weakness, raw survival instinct overrode his physical limitations. In a blur of desperate motion, his left hand lashed out, gripping Eleanor firmly by the throat and pinning her hard against the jagged rock wall. His right hand, trembling severely but resolutely determined, drew a heavy, blued Colt revolver from a hidden shoulder holster, pressing the cold steel barrel directly beneath her chin. "Who are you?" Silas rasped, his voice a dry, menacing gravel that scraped against the stone walls like sandpaper. Eleanor choked, her hands flying up to grip his thick, corded wrist, but his hold was like an iron vise. The stale air left her lungs in a rush. She stared down the dark barrel of the gun, watching the outlaw's fevered eyes dart frantically around the dimly lit cave, assessing the unknown threat, recognizing the dried blood coating her hands and the tight bandages constricting his chest. He was a hunted man, waking up entirely vulnerable in the presence of a stranger, and outlaws rarely survived by trusting easily. Would the notorious Silas Thorne pull the trigger before his fevered mind comprehended she had just saved his miserable life? His thumb pulled back the heavy hammer of the Colt with a loud, ominous click. The cold steel of the Colt revolver pressed against Eleanor's throat felt heavier than the mountain of snow burying the canyon outside. Death had come calling twice in one day, and she flatly refused to open the door. Look down. Mr. Thorne," Eleanor commanded, her voice surprisingly steady, a sharp, aristocratic whip cracking through the stagnant cave air. "Look at your chest. Look at the bloody knife on the stone. Then ask yourself if a bounty hunter would bother mending a ruined shoulder before collecting her prize." Silas blinked, his stormy eyes fighting through the heavy veil of fever and exhaustion. His gaze drifted downward, taking in the crude, tight bandages, the scent of scorched copper, and the deformed lump of lead resting near his boots. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The heavy revolver wavered, the hammer decocking with a sharp mechanical snap, and the weapon slipped from his numb fingers. He collapsed backward against the unforgiving stone, gasping for air, the last reserves of his adrenaline entirely spent. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the small alcove, broken only by the distant, muffled howling of the blizzard beyond the canyon walls and the crackling of the small fire. Eleanor massaged her bruised throat, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She picked up the discarded Colt, feeling the heavy, lethal weight of the iron in her hands, and placed it deliberately out of his immediate reach. She then retrieved the tin cup, poured a small measure of the harsh rye whiskey, and held it to his pale lips. Silas drank greedily, coughing as the cheap liquor burned a fiery path down his throat. The liquor seemed to anchor him to reality. The feral panic in his eyes receded, replaced by a wary, calculating intelligence. He studied her face in the flickering amber light. He saw the fine cut of her ruined morning dress, the delicate features hardened by sudden, brutal exposure, and the dried blood coating her pale hands. He saw a woman who belonged in a parlor, entirely out of place in the unforgiving bowels of Blackwood Canyon. "You know my name," Silas rasped, his voice a dry, gravelly whisper. "But you are no lawman. And you are certainly no local. Who are you, and why are you freezing to death in the dark?" "My name is Eleanor," she replied, her chin rising instinctively, a lingering remnant of her former station. "Eleanor Vance!" The reaction was instantaneous. Silas stiffened, his jaw locking tight as a dark, dangerous shadow crossed his face. He spat a mouthful of bloody phlegm onto the cavern floor, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "Vance," he repeated, the name tasting like ash and poison in his mouth. "Arthur Vance's kin, the cattle baron, the king of the Wyoming Territory. You have a terrible habit of keeping treacherous company, Miss Vance." "Arthur Vance was my father," Eleanor countered, her voice trembling slightly with fresh grief and rising anger. "He died a week ago, and I was cast out of my own home by his brother, Elias. I have nothing left but the clothes on my back and the freezing mud on my boots. So spare me your judgment, Mr. Thorne." Silas stared at her, genuinely taken aback by the venom in her tone. He searched her face for deception, finding only profound, raw loss and a burning, desperate indignation. The pieces of a much larger, darker puzzle began to align in his mind. The legendary Arthur Vance, a man known throughout the territory for his stubborn refusal to yield his lands to the encroaching railroad syndicates, was dead. And his only heir was thrown to the wolves. It was a maneuver that reeked of calculated, ruthless ambition. "Elias," Silas muttered, closing his eyes as a wave of pain washed over him. "Of course, the serpent sheds its skin. You know my uncle?" Eleanor asked, leaning closer to the dying fire. Silas let out a harsh, humorless laugh that ended in a violent fit of coughing. He clutched his bandaged chest, waiting for the agony to subside before meeting her gaze again. The firelight danced across the deep lines etched into his weathered face, revealing a profound, weary sorrow that contradicted the savage reputation printed on the bounty posters. "Know him?" Silas whispered bitterly. "Elias Vance is the architect of my damnation." In the quiet isolation of the cave, with the storm raging as a barrier against the rest of the world, the barriers between the aristocratic exile and the hunted outlaw began to shatter. Silas spoke, his words painting a horrifying portrait of the frontier's hidden underbelly. He told her of his life after the war, a desperate attempt to find peace on a small homestead near the valley of Cross Creek. He spoke of his wife, a gentle woman who planted wheat in the hard soil, and his son, who chased wild dogs across the prairie. Then, the railroad surveyors arrived. They offered pennies for the land. When Silas refused, the intimidation began. Poisoned wells, slaughtered livestock, finally, fire in the dead of night. Silas had been away purchasing supplies. He returned to find his homestead reduced to smoking ash, his family gone, buried beneath the charred timbers. "I wanted justice," Silas continued, his voice devoid of all emotion, a hollow vessel of grief. "I went to the territorial marshals. I went to the judges, but they were all blind. They were all bought. Before he could enact his own vengeance, the Gold Star Express was derailed. A massive payroll shipment destined for the mining camps was stolen. and a dozen innocent homesteaders traveling in the rear cars were brutally massacred. The territorial authorities found the weapons used in the slaughter abandoned at the scene, cavalry carbines, specifically registered to Silas Thorne's former Union regiment. He was branded a monster overnight, a convenient scapegoat for a massacre he never committed. I have spent a year running, hiding like a whipped dog in these canyons, Silas said, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. Hunting the men who actually pulled the triggers. I found one 2 days ago. Before he bled out, he gave me the name of the man who paid for the fire at my farm, the man who orchestrated the train robbery to fund his massive land acquisitions, and the man who currently holds the deeds to half the territory. Eleanor felt the breath leave her lungs. The sheer scale of the corruption was staggering. Elias. Silas nodded slowly. Your uncle is building an empire on a foundation of slaughtered innocents and stolen land. He needed capital to bribe the territorial governors and secure the railroad contracts. The Gold Star payroll provided that capital. The massacre provided the fear necessary to drive the remaining homesteaders away from the valuable routes. The revelation hit Eleanor with the force of a runaway locomotive. Her father's death was not merely the result of a greedy brother coveting a successful ranch. Arthur Vance was a man of staunch principles. He would have discovered the missing homesteaders, the coerced land sales, the dirty money flooding into Elias's accounts. Arthur Vance was murdered because he was a righteous obstacle in the path of a monopolistic tyrant. Elias had poisoned his own brother to clear the final hurdle, and he had thrown Eleanor into the blizzard to ensure the grave held its secrets forever. The profound tragedy of the situation settled heavily upon her shoulders. She looked at Silas, truly seeing him for the first time. He was not the bloodthirsty bandit the broadsheets claimed. He was a father robbed of his future, a soldier betrayed by the country he bled for, and a victim of the exact same monstrous greed that had stolen her own life. They were two ghosts, murdered by the same hand, left to rot in the forgotten corners of the earth. A bullet is too simple for a man like Elias, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register that surprised even herself. The refined lady of the manor was dead, frozen somewhere on the trek from the estate. The woman sitting by the fire was forged in the crucible of betrayal and survival. If you kill him, you remain a wanted murderer. The syndicates will just install another tyrant in his place, and my father's name remains forever tarnished. Silas looked at her, his brows furrowing in pain and curiosity. What are you suggesting, Miss Vance? We need proof, Eleanor stated, her mind working with a rapid, terrifying clarity. Elias is arrogant, but he is also a meticulous accountant. He trusts no one. He records every transaction, every bribe, every stolen dollar. He keeps ledgers. I have seen them. Black leather books locked in a heavy iron safe in his private office at Cross Creek. Cross Creek is a fortress, Silas warned, shifting uncomfortably against the rock. It is owned entirely by your uncle. The lawmen there wear his brand. We walk in there, we hang before the sun sets. Then we do not walk in blindly, Eleanor countered, leaning forward, the firelight catching the fierce determination in her eyes. You have the skills to survive the wilderness, to evade the marshals, to fight. I know his schedules. I know the layout of his operations. I know the combinations to his private locks. I am a dead woman. Mr. Thorne, you are a dead man. What do dead people have left to fear? Silas stared at the exiled heiress for a long, heavy moment. The silence between them felt charged, electric with the weight of an unspoken, incredibly dangerous alliance. They were fire and ice, forced together by a cruel twist of fate, united by a shared enemy and a desperate, burning mutual need for absolute justice. We expose the ledgers to the federal circuit judge, Eleanor finished. We tear down his empire brick by brick. We clear your name, and we avenge my father. A slow, grim smile touched the corners of Silas's pale lips. He reached out with his uninjured arm, offering a rough, calloused hand across the small fire. Eleanor took it, her slender, blood-stained fingers gripping his firmly. The pact was sealed in the dark, a solemn vow sworn over the ashes of their former lives. The hours crept by, the fire burning down to a low, pulsing mound of red coals. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the demonic howling of the wind outside began to shift. The raging blizzard was breaking, the heavy snow giving way to an eerie, unnatural calm. Eleanor let her weary head rest against the cavern wall, sleep finally threatening to overtake her exhausted mind. But as the wind died down, the silence of the canyon amplified every other sound. Silas suddenly sat bolt upright, his hand instinctively grasping for the empty holster at his side. He ignored the searing pain in his chest, his eyes wide and fixed on the narrow entrance of the cave. Eleanor froze, her heart leaping into her throat, distinct and rhythmic. The sound drifted through the freezing air. It was the heavy crunch of boots breaking through the fresh crust of the snow. Someone was out there in the dark. Silas had bled heavily before reaching the sanctuary, and a frozen trail of crimson was a perfect map for a hunter who did not sleep. The crunch of heavy boots on fresh snow is the unmistakable signature of a predator closing in on its prey. In the frozen silence of Blackwood Canyon, that rhythmic crushing of ice meant their borrowed time had violently expired. Silas clamped a heavy, calloused hand over Eleanor's mouth before she could draw a sharp breath, his stormy eyes wide and demanding absolute silence. The fire had burned down to mere embers, casting a faint, dying red glow against the jagged walls. Outside, the howling wind had died completely, leaving behind a pristine, deadly stillness. Through that stillness came the distinct, horrifying sound of men wading through knee-deep drifts, accompanied by the low, eager whining of tracking hounds. Marshal Blackwood, Silas breathed, his voice barely a vibration against Eleanor's ear. Elias pays him a small fortune to keep the county clean of loose ends. He brought dogs. Eleanor nodded, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pulled away from his grip, her mind rapidly shifting from the warmth of their fragile alliance back to the freezing, brutal reality of survival. The aristocratic heiress who had wept on the icy plains was gone, replaced by a woman who recognized that hesitation meant a shallow grave. She moved with a silent, frantic efficiency, scooping damp soil over the remaining coals to smother the light in the scent of smoke. She grabbed the heavy canvas bedroll, the lantern, and the Colt revolver, shoving the weapon firmly into Silas's uninjured hand. They slipped out of the shallow alcove just as a beam from a bullseye lantern swept across the canyon entrance, casting long, distorted shadows against the stone. Eleanor took the lead, guiding Silas deeper into the twisting labyrinth of the gorge. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky the color of bruised iron and a biting, crystalline cold that burned the inside of their lungs. The path upward was a treacherous incline of loose shale hidden beneath a thick layer of fresh, powder snow. Silas stumbled, a sharp gasp escaping his lips as his boots failed to find purchase. The makeshift bandages around his chest tightened, a fresh wave of crimson seeping slowly through the cotton. He was losing strength rapidly, his heavy frame leaning heavily against the frozen canyon wall. Eleanor did not offer pity. Pity was a useless currency in the wild. She grabbed the thick leather collar of his coat, digging her own freezing feet into the stone, and hauled him upward with a sudden, surprising strength. Her mourning dress, once a symbol of high society grief, was now a torn, mud-stained rag clinging to her shivering frame. She had ripped strips from the bottom hem, binding the thick canvas of the bedroll around her ruined leather slippers to create crude, insulated boots. Silas watched her as he fought through the haze of his agony, witnessing a profound transformation. She was not breaking under the weight of the frontier. She was hardening, adapting to the brutal landscape with the same unyielding grit her father had possessed. The deep, resonant baying of a bloodhound echoed violently through the narrow rock corridor, a sound that chilled the blood faster than the winter air. The posse had found the alcove. They had found the blood-stained earth and the freshly smothered ashes. The hunt was no longer a search. It was a sprint to the executioner's block. "They have the scent," Silas rasped, forcing himself to a vertical climb, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. "We cannot outrun hounds in this snow. We need to break the trail." Eleanor scanned the towering, unforgiving walls of the gorge. The morning sun was beginning to crest the peaks, casting a blinding, harsh glare across the white expanse. About 50 yards ahead, tucked behind a massive, jutting boulder, she spotted a structure that defied the natural geology of the canyon. It was a framework of ancient, rotting timbers, half buried under a century of rockfalls and snowdrifts, an abandoned silver mine. "There," Eleanor pointed, dragging Silas forward by his uninjured arm. They reached the collapsed entrance, the wooden beams groaning ominously under the weight of the accumulated snow. The main shaft had caved in long ago, but a narrow, jagged crevice remained, a dark, suffocating fissure plunging straight into the bowels of the mountain. Silas hesitated, the claustrophobic terror of the dark void warring against the immediate threat of the dogs. But the hounds were baying louder now, their desperate, hungry cries echoing just around the bend of the canyon wall. Eleanor did not wait for his consent. She pushed him firmly into the narrow gap, squeezing her own slender frame in right behind him. She pulled a heavy, snow-covered branch across the opening, plunging them into absolute, terrifying darkness. The air inside the shaft was dead and heavy, thick with the metallic scent of copper dust and ancient decay. The walls were agonizingly tight, forcing Eleanor and Silas to press their bodies entirely flush against one another. They shuffled backward into the suffocating gloom, the uneven ground threatening to twist their ankles with every blind step, until they hit a solid wall of collapsed rock. They were trapped. Outside, the crunch of heavy boots grew deafening. The hounds were practically on top of the boulder, their frantic sniffing and whining filtering through the cracks in the rotting timber. "Hold them back," a deep, cruel voice commanded, vibrating through the stone walls. It was Thaddeus Blackwood. "The blood trail ends here." The bandit crawled into a hole to die. Inside the crevice, Silas's breathing grew dangerously ragged. The exertion of the climb and the agonizing pain of his wound were tearing at his consciousness. His chest heaved against Eleanor, a desperate struggle for oxygen that threatened to betray their position. If Blackwood heard even a whisper of movement, he would order his men to tear the timbers apart and shoot whatever moved in the dark. Eleanor reacted purely on instinct. She pressed her back firmly against the cold, damp rock, wrapping her arms tightly around Silas's neck and burying her face into the collar of his heavy coat. She pressed her hand firmly against his mouth, muffling his desperate gasps. He stiffened, his rigid muscles pressing heavily against her soft frame. But he did not fight her. In the pitch black of the collapsed mine, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the heavy, terrifying proximity of their bodies. Eleanor could feel the frantic, heavy pounding of his heart against her own chest, a frantic drumbeat that slowly began to sync with her own terrified pulse. The overwhelming scent of his sweat, the metallic tang of his blood, and the raw, masculine heat radiating from his skin enveloped her completely. She was acutely aware of the hard lines of his jaw beneath her trembling fingers, the desperate strength in the arm he wrapped instinctively around her waist to keep from collapsing. It was a profoundly intimate collision born of sheer terror and shared trauma. The boundaries of their former lives, the wealthy heiress and the hunted outlaw, dissolved entirely in the claustrophobic dark. For a fleeting, infinite moment, there was no Elias, no stolen empire, no freezing wilderness. There were only two desperate souls clinging to one another, finding an unexpected, fierce comfort in the very heart of danger. A deep, unspoken tension ignited between them, a profound realization that their fates were now inextricably, intimately bound. Above them, the heavy boots stepped onto the rotting timbers spanning the mine entrance. Dust and small fragments of loose rock rained down upon their faces. Eleanor held her breath until her lungs screamed for release, her eyes squeezed tightly shut, praying to a God she hoped still watched over the lawless West. Silas remained perfectly still beneath her touch, his uninjured hand gripping her waist with a fierce, protective intensity. "Snow's drifting heavy over the rocks," another gruff voice muttered outside. "Dogs are confused by the draft from the fissure. Could be a drop-off." "Let the mountain have him," Blackwood growled, his voice fading slightly. "A man with a hole in his lung won't survive the frost anyway." We head back to Cross Creek. Elias expects a full report by sundown, and I am not freezing my boots off for a corpse. The heavy footsteps began to retreat, the baying of the hounds growing distant and muffled as the posse moved back down the canyon trail. Eleanor did not release her hold. She kept her hand over Silas's mouth, her body pressed flush against his, listening to the agonizingly slow fade of their executioners. When the silence finally reclaimed the canyon, Eleanor slowly lowered her hand. Silas exhaled a long, shuddering breath, his forehead resting heavily against hers in the dark. The tension between them did not dissipate with the departure of the posse. Rather, it thickened, hanging heavy and undeniable in the stagnant air. He pulled back slightly, the invisible space between them suddenly feeling colder, more dangerous than the men outside. "They will return to Cross Creek," Silas whispered, his voice rough and deeply unsteady. "They believe I am dead. We have the advantage of ghosts." Eleanor nodded in the dark, her hands still resting on the lapels of his coat. They had survived the immediate slaughter, but they were buried alive in a collapsed mine with a blizzard raging across the plains, separating them from their vengeance. She reached out blindly, her fingers brushing against the cold, jagged rock of the tunnel behind them. The air here was not entirely stagnant. A faint, icy draft was pulling inward, deeper into the suffocating abyss of the mountain. Where did the black tunnel lead? And would the rotting earth hold their weight long enough to find the light again? The black belly of the mountain offered a temporary tomb, but the true crucible of their survival awaited on the unforgiving, sun-scorched floor of the Wyoming Basin. For 2 agonizing days, Eleanor and Silas followed the icy, invisible draft through the claustrophobic arteries of the collapsed silver mine. They crawled over jagged rock falls and squeezed through suffocating fissures, the absolute darkness pressing against their sanity. When they finally breached the surface on the leeward side of the mountain range, the frozen brutality of the high passes gave way to a vast, arid expanse of scrub brush and cracked earth. The sudden, blinding sunlight felt like a physical assault. The violent blizzard had spent its fury against the peaks, leaving the lower plains locked in a bitter, dry cold that offered no water and no shelter. The descent took a heavy toll. Silas was failing. The wound in his chest, hastily patched with torn petticoats and raw whiskey, burned with a deep, sickening heat. Every step down the steep scree slope sent fresh tremors of agony radiating through his heavily muscled frame. Eleanor refused to let him fall. She became his crutch, wrapping his heavy arm over her shoulders, her own body bruised and starved, driven solely by an unnatural, burning stamina forged in the fires of vengeance. When the sun finally dipped below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in deep, bruised hues of violet and rust, Silas collapsed entirely. They had reached a dry riverbed, a shallow depression offering meager protection from the biting wind. Eleanor hastily gathered dead sagebrush, striking her remaining matches with trembling, bloody fingers until a small, fragile fire sparked to life. She dragged Silas closer to the warmth, but the heat offered no comfort. His fever had returned with a vengeance, accompanied by a terror that had absolutely nothing to do with Thaddeus Blackwood or her uncle Elias. Silas tossed violently in the dirt, his eyes rolled back, trapped in a waking nightmare. He shouted hoarse, desperate commands to men who had died a decade ago. He was no longer a hunted outlaw in Wyoming. He was a Union cavalryman drowning in the blood-soaked mud of Antietam. He thrashes wildly, his uninjured arm swinging at invisible phantoms, screaming about artillery fire and the agonizing screams of dying horses. The ghosts of the Civil War had risen from the dirt to drag him back into the slaughter. Eleanor did not shrink away from the violent display of his broken mind. The refined women of her former life would have fled in absolute terror from such raw, unhinged masculinity. Eleanor Vance knelt in the dirt, grabbed his flailing wrists, and pinned them to the cold earth with every ounce of strength she possessed. "Silas," she commanded, her voice cutting through his panicked delirium like a silver blade. "The war is over. The guns are quiet. Look at me," he gasped, his chest heaving, his cloudy eyes finally locking onto hers. The feral panic slowly dissolved, replaced by a profound, soul-crushing sorrow. Tears, born of pure exhaustion and deeply buried trauma, cut clean tracks through the grime on his weathered face. He had survived the bloodiest conflict in American history, only to have his family stolen by the very country he fought to preserve. The heavy armor of the notorious bandit fell away, leaving behind a profoundly vulnerable, shattered man. "I can still smell the copper," he whispered, his voice shattering in the quiet night. "No matter how far I ride, the ground is always bleeding." Eleanor released his wrists and carefully pulled his heavy head into her lap, her fingers gently stroking his tangled, sweat-soaked hair. She offered no hollow platitudes about time healing all wounds, for she knew the frontier dealt only in permanent scars. Instead, she offered the quiet, unwavering strength of a woman who had just watched her own world burn to ash. "We all carry the dead, Silas," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the dancing embers. "My father, your wife, your son, we carry them so they are not forgotten, but we cannot let their graves become our own. We have a debt to collect." In the stark desolation of the dry wash, Eleanor became his anchor. She proved that true frontier resilience was not merely the ability to draw a gun faster than the next man, but the profound emotional fortitude required to endure the crushing weight of the past. Silas closed his eyes, his erratic breathing finally slowing, finding a strange, fierce peace in the gentle touch of the exiled heiress. The bond between them shifted from a desperate alliance of survival to a deep, undeniable intimacy rooted in mutual salvation. By the next afternoon, the desolate landscape yielded a grim discovery. A thick plume of greasy, black smoke stained the pale horizon, drawing them cautiously toward a shallow valley. It was not a town. It was a sprawling, wretched collection of sod dugouts, canvas tents, and splintered wagons. As they approached, the stench of sickness, unwashed bodies, and despair hung heavy in the stagnant air. This was a settlement of displaced immigrants, Polish laborers and German farmers who had journeyed across an ocean on the false promises of the railroad syndicates. They had been sold worthless deeds by Elias's shell companies, lured to the frontier, and then violently driven off the only arable land by hired thugs when the surveyor lines changed. Eleanor walked through the camp, her heart twisting violently in her chest. Men with broken limbs sat uselessly by cold fire pits. Women with hollow, haunted eyes clutched starving children wrapped in filthy rags. She recognized the Vance cattle brand burned into the wooden crates stacked near the center of the camp. Her family's wealth, her finishing school education, her silken dresses, they were all funded by this profound, engineered human misery. Elias had not merely stolen her inheritance. He had built an empire on the broken backs of the innocent. The prejudice of the era allowed men like her uncle to treat these immigrants as disposable livestock. Silas watched Eleanor take in the horror, reading the deep shame and boiling anger warring on her face. "This is Elias's true legacy," Silas murmured, leaning heavily against a shattered wagon wheel. "We are going to burn it to the ground," Eleanor replied, her voice cold and devoid of any hesitation. Their grim resolve was immediately tested as the sun sank below the western ridges. The rhythmic, terrifying thunder of approaching hooves vibrated through the cracked earth. The camp erupted into chaotic panic. Mothers grabbed their children, and unarmed men scrambled desperately for cover. A dozen riders crested the ridge, silhouetted against the dying light. They wore heavy dusters and carried torches, their face hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. They were Elias's enforcers, returning to finish the eviction and burn the remaining tents to ash. Silas's demeanor changed instantly. The haunted survivor vanished, replaced by the lethal, calculating soldier. He ignored the burning pain in his chest, snatching a heavy, rusted Henry repeating rifle from the trembling hands of an injured homesteader. "Find cover, Eleanor," Silas ordered, chambering around with a sharp, metallic clack. "Keep your head down." Eleanor ignored the command. She drew the heavy Colt revolver Silas had given her in the canyon, stepping out from the shadow of the wagon to stand shoulder to shoulder with the wanted man. She gripped the cold iron with both hands, her jaw set, refusing to cower while her uncle's dogs slaughtered the helpless. The riders descended like a plague, whooping wildly, tossing torches onto the dry canvas roofs. The camp ignited in a chaotic inferno of screaming and stampeding horses. Silas raised the Henry rifle. He did not fire wildly. He picked his targets with a chilling, disciplined precision. The rifle cracked, a sharp report that cut through the chaos, and the lead rider tumbled backward from his saddle, dead before he struck the dust. Silas cycled the action and fired again, dropping a second man attempting to hurl a bottle of black powder. The enforcers realized too late they had ridden into a hornet's nest. They turned their heavy revolvers toward the wagon, sending a hail of lead tearing through the wooden spokes and splintering the frame. Eleanor felt the wind of a passing bullet tug sharply at her hair. Fear threatened to paralyze her, but the sight of a rider raising a heavy pistol toward a fleeing mother ignited a righteous fury. She raised the Colt, aligning the sights just as her father had taught her on lazy Sunday afternoons behind the manor. She pulled the heavy trigger. The recoil sent a shockwave up her arms, but the rider jerked violently, his pistol discharging harmlessly into the dirt as he slumped over his saddle horn. She had taken a life. The reality hit her, harsh and uncompromising, but she did not break. She cocked the hammer and fired again, caught in a deadly crossfire between a phantom outlaw and a hardened heiress. The remaining enforcers broke rank. They spurred their mounts, abandoning their dead and fleeing blindly back into the darkening plains toward Cross Creek. The camp fell silent, save for the crackling of burning canvas and the quiet weeping of the survivors. Silas lowered the smoking rifle, turning to look at Eleanor. Her chest heaved, the heavy pistol still gripped tightly in her hands, her eyes wide but terrifyingly clear. The final remnants of the sheltered aristocrat were gone. She was a true daughter of the West, forged in blood and fire. They had saved the settlement, but the victory was a double-edged sword. The surviving riders wore the Vance brand, and they were riding hard for the Viper's Nest. Will Elias realize the ghosts of his past are marching heavily toward his fortress? And what deadly welcome will await them when they finally breach the gates of Cross Creek? Cross Creek did not smell of frontier opportunity. It reeked of raw coal smoke, stale rye whiskey, and the unwashed desperation of broken men. The expanding railroad had dragged the settlement forcefully out of the dust, transforming it into a booming, violent monument to Elias Vance's soaring ambition. Gas lamps hissed aggressively along the main thoroughfare, casting harsh yellow pools over muddy streets choked with freight wagons, drunken laborers, and heavily armed enforcers wearing the Vance cattle brand. It was a town built entirely on stolen blood, and tonight the ghosts of the frontier had come to collect their due. Eleanor and Silas moved like fleeting shadows through the suffocating filth of the back alleys. Silas walked with a rigid, agonizing stiffness. His rising fever kept at bay only by sheer, stubborn will and the biting chill of the night air. He kept the wide brim of his hat pulled low over his eyes, his face a grim ruin of exhaustion and pain. Eleanor walked close beside him, wrapped tightly in a stolen, oversized canvas duster that concealed her torn clothing and the heavy Colt revolver tucked securely into her waistband. Her heart hammered a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs, but her hands remained perfectly steady. The fiery crucible of the wilderness had burned away her fear, leaving behind a cold, hardened resolve. The Vance Imperial Bank loomed at the far end of the street, a monstrous three-story edifice constructed of dark red brick and heavy wrought iron. The top floor belonged entirely to Elias, serving as the nerve center for his corrupt empire. Eleanor knew her uncle's rigid, arrogant routines intimately. Every evening at exactly 8 o'clock, he descended from his fortress to the private dining room of the Grand Hotel across the street, feasting on imported beef while the town suffered beneath him. The bank's main vaults would be locked tight, but the private office upstairs would rely on a solitary, heavily armed watchman guarding the rear fire escape. They reached the iron stairs clinging to the back of the brick building, the shadows deep and concealing. A massive thug leaned heavily against the iron railing, striking a match to light a rolled cigarette. Silas motioned firmly for Eleanor to stay back against the brick wall. He dissolved into the darkness, moving with the terrifying, silent grace of a veteran cavalry scout navigating enemy lines. A brief, muffled scuffle ensued on the landing above. There were no shouts, just the sickening, heavy thud of a rifle stock meeting bone, followed by the heavy slump of a body collapsing onto the iron grating. Silas appeared at the railing, waving her up the stairs. Eleanor stepped carefully over the unconscious guard and approached the heavy oak door. Elias was a creature of profound paranoia, but his arrogance made him predictable. He had installed a heavy brass tumbler lock, trusting in the sheer weight of the metal. Eleanor retrieved a thin, steel hairpin she had salvaged from her ruined updo days ago. During her sheltered youth, she had spent countless hours picking the locks of her father's study simply to read forbidden adventure novels. Her fingers, though calloused and scraped from the harsh journey, worked the internal tumblers with practiced, delicate precision. The heavy bolt slid back with a dull, satisfying mechanical clunk. The office was a temple of obscene, stolen wealth. Thick Persian rugs covered the floor, deadening their footsteps, and the warm air held the heavy, cloying scent of imported cigars and expensive brandy. It was a jarring, sickening contrast to the freezing starvation she had endured just miles away. Behind a massive mahogany desk, bolted firmly to the floorboards, sat a heavy cast-iron safe. "He changes the combination monthly," Eleanor whispered, dropping to her knees before the iron behemoth. "But he completely lacks imagination. He uses significant dates, treaties, acquisitions, foreclosures." She spun the heavy dial, her mind racing rapidly through the timeline of Elias's betrayals. She settled on the date the Gold Star Express was violently derailed, the exact day the massive influx of blood money started flowing into his accounts. Left, right, left. The heavy internal tumblers clicked solidly into place. She grabbed the heavy iron lever, applying her entire body weight, and the thick door swung open with a quiet groan. Inside sat towering stacks of minted silver certificates and neatly bound legal deeds. But Eleanor ignored the fortune entirely. She reached past the currency, her fingers closing around a stack of thick, black, leather-bound ledgers. She pulled the top book free, opening it and holding the pages up to the pale moonlight filtering through the frosted window pane. The meticulous, elegant handwriting detailed every single atrocity. Bribes paid directly to Marshal Thaddeus Blackwood to ignore the murdered homesteaders. The exact cost of the mercenary riders hired to burn Silas's farm to ash. And there, neatly recorded on the final page, was the payment made to the physician who supplied the bitter almond poison used to murder Arthur Vance. Seeing her beloved father's assassination reduced to a simple line item of business expense hit Eleanor like a physical blow to the stomach. A cold, righteous fury settled permanently into her bones. It was a comprehensive, damning taxonomy of pure evil. And it was all the proof they needed to hang her uncle from the highest gallows in the territory. Silas took the heavy ledgers from her trembling hands, shoving them securely into his canvas saddlebag. The irrefutable proof was secured. The crushing weight of their impending justice settled heavily over them, a momentary, deeply intoxicating triumph. They shared a look in the dim light, an unspoken acknowledgement of the impossible odds they had just defeated together. They quickly descended the iron stairs, slipping past the unconscious guard. intending to blend back into the chaotic shadows of the alleyway behind the saloons. But fate in the untamed West was a fickle, notoriously cruel mistress. As they hurried past the rear exit of a raucous gambling hall, the heavy wooden door swung violently outward, vomiting a drunk, desperate prospector directly into the muddy alley. The man stumbled hard, his kerosene lantern swinging wildly on its wire handle. The harsh yellow light washed directly over Silas's face. The prospector froze mid-step, the hazy veil of whiskey instantly evaporating from his wide eyes. He stared at the deeply scarred, angular jaw, the stormy eyes, the heavy canvas coat. The wanted posters were burned permanently into the minds of every desperate soul in the Wyoming Territory. $5,000 in bounty money stood right in front of him. The man did not speak a single word. He dropped his lantern, shattering the glass against the mud, turned swiftly on his heel, and sprinted frantically back into the crowded saloon, shouting wildly at the top of his lungs for the local deputies. The reaction of the town was terrifyingly instantaneous. The raucous, out-of-tune piano music inside the hall abruptly ceased. The underlying cacophony of Cross Creek shifted rapidly from drunken revelry to the sharp, terrifying bark of authoritative orders and the heavy stomping of boots rapidly hitting the wooden boardwalks. Silas grabbed Eleanor's arm tightly, pulling her deeper into the dark labyrinth of stacked shipping crates and overflowing horse troughs. But the alleyways were suddenly choked with movement. Armed men spilled out of the surrounding buildings like angry hornets from a kicked nest. Bright lanterns flared at both ends of the narrow street, cutting off their immediate escape routes. Thaddeus Blackwood had apparently returned from the mountain pass empty-handed, and his simmering rage was now boiling over into lethal action. His deep, cruel voice echoed violently over the rooftops, screaming for his deputies to lock down the perimeters and seal the town tight. The entire settlement was actively closing its jaws around them, transforming Cross Creek from a bustling hub of commerce into an inescapable, heavily armed slaughterhouse. The black ledgers were heavy in their hands, the ultimate key to their absolute salvation. But they were now entirely surrounded by a small army of mercenaries eager to collect the highest bounty in the state. How could a severely wounded outlaw and an exiled heiress possibly break through a solid wall of riflemen? And would the damning evidence survive the inevitable? Incoming storm of flying lead. A cornered animal is at its most lethal, and in the suffocating dark of the Cross Creek livery stable, Silas Thorne and Eleanor Vance had absolutely nowhere left to run. They had sprinted through the muddy alleyways, dodging the frantic beams of kerosene lanterns and the shouting deputies, only to find themselves entirely blockaded within the massive wooden structure at the edge of town. The heavy sliding doors groaned in protest as Silas shoved a broken wagon axle against the iron handles, barricading them inside with a dozen terrified, stamping horses. The air was thick with the suffocating stench of old hay, raw leather, and the sharp, coppery tang of Silas's freshly bleeding wound. The sprint had torn his crude stitches wide open, and the heavy canvas of his coat was rapidly soaking through with dark, warm crimson. Outside, the chaotic stomping of boots coalesced into a disciplined, lethal perimeter. Marshal Thaddeus Blackwood had finally corralled his prey. His voice, a deep, cruel baritone, vibrated through the thin pine boards of the stable, carrying the absolute authority of a man who owned the judge and the undertaker alike. "Throw the ledgers and the woman out into the mud! Thorne!" Blackwood commanded, the sound of lever-action rifles aggressively cycling echoing behind his words. "Do that, and I promise you a quick drop from a sturdy rope. Make us come in there, and I will let the dogs tear you apart while you still draw breath." Silas did not waste his fading oxygen on a reply. He sank heavily to his knees behind an overturned water trough, resting the barrel of his stolen Henry rifle over the thick wood. His hands trembled violently, his face a terrifying canvas of pale gray skin and deep, feverish shadows. He looked at Eleanor. She stood beside a massive draft horse, her stolen canvas duster stained with soot, her knuckles white as she gripped the heavy Colt revolver. The aristocratic heiress was dead, buried beneath the frost of the plains. The woman standing in the shadows of the stable was a hardened survivor, ready to kill or die for the black leather books currently resting at her feet. "Keep your head low," Silas rasped, his stormy eyes locking onto the main doors. "They will shoot through the walls first." The eruption of violence was deafening and instantaneous. The posse did not wait for an answer. A terrifying hail of hot lead tore through the thin pine siding of the stable, splintering the wood into jagged, flying shrapnel. The sheer volume of fire was a brutal, uncompromising display of frontier force. The horses shrieked in absolute terror, rearing and kicking wildly in their stalls, their massive hooves smashing against the wooden partitions. The air inside the stable instantly filled with a thick, noxious cloud of white-black powder smoke, burning their eyes and choking their lungs. The reality of a gunfight was a far cry from the sanitized, honorable duels written about in Eastern dime novels. It was a chaotic, terrifying maelstrom of flying wood splinters, deafening noise, and the constant, agonizing anticipation of a bullet finding soft flesh. Silas returned fire with a chilling, mechanical precision. He tracked the muzzle flashes visible through the bullet holes in the walls, pulling the trigger and cycling the lever of the Henry rifle in a smooth, deadly rhythm. Two men outside screamed, their shadows crumpling against the muddy street. But the suppressing fire from the posse did not waver. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut against the flying debris, raising the Colt and firing blindly toward the heavy main doors, the recoil violently jarring her exhausted arms. They were hopelessly outgunned. Silas's ammunition was dwindling rapidly, and his physical strength was completely failing. His head slumped forward against the wooden trough, a low groan escaping his clenched teeth as the fever finally threatened to drag him under entirely. Then, the relentless barrage of gunfire from the street abruptly ceased, replaced by shouts of panicked confusion and the sudden, chaotic stomping of retreating boots. Eleanor risked a glance through a shattered knothole. Down the muddy thoroughfare, a heavy freight wagon was careening wildly toward the posse's barricade. At the reins sat Josef, the elderly Polish immigrant whose son had been brutally murdered by Elias's enforcers the week prior. He had seen Eleanor and the outlaw trapped in the stable, recognizing the woman who had stood between his people and the firing squad. The wagon bed was loaded entirely with stolen barrels of kerosene and heavy mining explosives. Josef did not slow down. He locked eyes with the terrified deputies, struck a match against the wooden buckboard, and hurled it directly into the saturated canvas covering the payload. The resulting explosion was a catastrophic shockwave of pure fire and concussive force, the entire street illuminated in a blinding, hellish orange glare, shattering every glass window within a 2-block radius. The posse's barricade was instantly vaporized, the deputies thrown violently through the air like discarded rag dolls. The oppressive grip of the siege was shattered by the tragic, desperate sacrifice of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. But Thaddeus Blackwood was not a man easily deterred by fire. As the deputies scrambled in the burning street, the side door of the stable's tack room was brutally kicked off its iron hinges. Blackwood stepped through the splintered frame, a massive double-barreled shotgun leveled directly at Silas. He fired instantly. The heavy spray of buckshot missed Silas's head by a fraction of an inch, utterly obliterating the wooden trough and sending a shower of sharp splinters deep into Silas's shoulder. Silas roared, a primal, agonizing sound born of pure survival. He abandoned the empty rifle and launched his heavy body forward, tackling the massive lawman directly into a pile of rusted horseshoes and leather harnesses. The struggle was a brutal, suffocating clash of desperate men. Blackwood possessed the distinct advantage of sheer size and uninjured health. He dropped the empty shotgun, wrapping his massive, calloused hands around Silas's throat, driving his thumbs viciously inward. Silas gagged, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of violet as the oxygen was violently severed from his brain. He thrashed blindly, his bloody fingers scrabbling desperately against the dirt floor. His hand found the bone handle of the heavy hunting knife he had used to dig the lead from his own chest days ago. With a final, explosive surge of adrenaline, Silas drove the blade forcefully upward, burying 7 inches of cold steel deep beneath Blackwood's rib cage. The corrupt marshal gasped, his eyes widening in sudden, profound shock. The iron grip on Silas's throat slackened instantly. Blackwood slumped backward into the dirt, his massive chest heaving once, twice, before settling into a permanent, glassy-eyed stillness. The butcher of Cross Creek was finally dead, his blood mixing freely with the horse manure and the mud. Silas rolled off the corpse, coughing violently, entirely unable to stand. Eleanor rushed to his side, hauling his heavy arm over her shoulder. The street outside was a chaotic inferno of shouting townsfolk and burning wagons, providing the exact cover they needed to breach the perimeter. They stumbled out of the shattered stable doors, disappearing into the thick, rolling clouds of black smoke, heading directly for the towering brick facade of the Grand Hotel. The opulent suite on the 3rd floor was a stark contrast to the burning violence of the street below. The heavy oak door swung open effortlessly beneath Eleanor's muddy boot. Inside, Elias Vance stood frantically over a large leather valise, violently stuffing thick stacks of gold certificates and heavy velvet pouches of jewelry into the bag. He was abandoning his empire, seeking to vanish into the Eastern Territories before the fire consumed his ledgers and his life. Elias froze as the door slammed against the wall. He looked up, his cold, calculating eyes widening slightly as he took in the horrifying sight of his niece. Eleanor was covered in a thick layer of soot, dried mud, and fresh blood. She stood tall, her breathing ragged but entirely controlled. The heavy barrel of the Colt revolver leveled directly at the center of his chest. Silas leaned heavily against the doorframe behind her, clutching the black leather ledger securely under his arm. "Eleanor," Elias breathed, his voice an oily, placating purr that entirely belied the cornered panic in his eyes. "You survived the frost. I severely underestimated the Vance resilience in your blood." "You underestimated everything." "Elias," Eleanor replied, her voice a flat, uncompromising anvil of pure ice. "You underestimated my father. You underestimated the people you starved, and you underestimated the man you framed." Elias slowly raised his hands, stepping away from the heavy valise. He was a master manipulator, entirely accustomed to buying his way out of the grave. "Put the gun down, child. You do not have the stomach for this. Murder is a heavy burden, and you are far too gentle to bear it. Give me the ledgers. I will give you the gold in this bag, and I will sign the Vance estate back over to your name. You can have your life back." "My life ended the night you poisoned my father's tea," Eleanor stated, her finger tightening deliberately against the heavy iron trigger. The profound, overwhelming urge to pull the hammer back, to watch the life drain from the eyes of the man who had stolen absolutely everything from her, was a physical ache in her chest. She wanted to bathe the Persian rugs in his blood. She wanted to exact the brutal, unforgiving justice of the frontier. Elias saw the hesitation, the moral warfare raging behind her soot-stained eyes. He smiled, a cold, venomous curling of his thin lips, and his right hand began to inch slowly toward the hidden silver derringer tucked inside his silk waistcoat. "You are weak, Eleanor, just like your father. You cling to a morality that simply does not exist in this country. The West is built entirely on the bones of the weak, and I am the architect of civilization." He drew the hidden pistol with a sudden, desperate speed, but he was entirely too slow. Eleanor did not shoot him in the heart. She adjusted her aim by a fraction of an inch and pulled the heavy trigger. The deafening roar of the Colt shattered the quiet opulence of the suite. The heavy lead slug shattered Elias's right shoulder, spinning him violently around and sending the small derringer clattering uselessly across the mahogany floorboards. Elias collapsed onto the expensive rugs, screaming in sudden, profound agony, clutching his ruined shoulder as a dark stain spread rapidly across his crisp, white shirt. "I am not weak, Uncle," Eleanor said softly, walking slowly toward his writhing form. She kicked the discarded derringer under the heavy bed frame. "And I am not a murderer. A bullet is far too quick a release for a man who has caused so much suffering. It would turn you into a tragic casualty of a lawless land. I will not grant you that dignity." A long, piercing, mournful wail echoed sharply through the night air, cutting effortlessly through the distant sounds of the burning town. The midnight train from Cheyenne was pulling heavily into the Cross Creek station. "That is the sound of your empire falling. Elias," Eleanor continued, looking down at the broken, bleeding tyrant. "The federal circuit judge is stepping off that train right now. He is a man you cannot buy, because you have absolutely nothing left to offer him. We have the ledgers. We have the accounts of your bribes, your hired guns, and your poisons. You will not die a frontier king. You will hang in a federal prison yard as a common thief and a traitor to the state." The corrupted king of Wyoming was finally bleeding on the floor, stripped entirely of his power and his dignity. But the legal machinery of the expanding West was notoriously slow and deeply vulnerable to the lingering influence of immense wealth. Will the newly arrived federal judge truly possess the unwavering fortitude to hold the baron accountable? Or does Elias possess enough hidden gold to buy his neck entirely out of the hangman's noose? Justice in the American West rarely wore a starched collar. But when the iron doors of the federal penitentiary finally slammed shut on Elias Vance, the resounding echo carried farther than any fired bullet. The arrival of the federal circuit judge, a man whose reputation for ruthless, unyielding integrity was forged in the bloody aftermath of the war, spelled the absolute end of the Vance monopoly. Elias had attempted to purchase his salvation, standing in the makeshift courtroom of the Cross Creek Town Hall, his arm bound tightly in a bloody sling. He offered the judge towering stacks of gold certificates, lucrative railroad shares, and titles to 10,000 acres of prime grazing land. The judge merely adjusted his spectacles, opened the black leather ledgers Eleanor and Silas had bled to secure, and began to read aloud the meticulous, damning taxonomy of pure evil. Every recorded bribe, every funded mercenary raid, and the exact price paid for the poison that stopped Arthur Vance's heart was exposed to the harsh light of day. Elias was stripped of his holdings, his false dignity, and his freedom. 2 months later, the corrupt baron faced the hangman's noose in the heavily guarded courtyard of the territorial capital, dying as a common murderer while the empire he built crumbled to ash behind him. With the ledgers made entirely public, the false narrative constructed around Silas Thorne completely collapsed. The territorial governor, faced with undeniable, written proof of the massive conspiracy surrounding the Gold Star Express massacre, issued a full and unconditional pardon. Silas walked out of the Cheyenne courthouse a free citizen, the crushing weight of a $5,000 bounty finally lifted from his weary shoulders. He was no longer a hunted ghost of the plains. He was simply a man, standing in the bright morning sun, breathing air that did not taste of gunpowder, betrayal, and relentless fear. Eleanor Vance had her family name entirely cleared of the treasonous slander her uncle had fabricated to steal her birthright. The massive estate, the sprawling thousands of acres of prime land, and the grand manor house were legally restored to her hand. She stood once more on the wide veranda of the home her father had built, looking out over the vast, rolling plains of Wyoming. The brutal winter snows had finally melted, giving way to the vibrant green of early spring. It was an empire of staggering wealth and absolute power. Yet, as she looked upon the massive herds of cattle and the endless miles of boundary fences, she felt no triumph. The soil beneath her boots was permanently saturated with the blood of her father, the displaced immigrants, and the desperate men who had died defending a corrupt king. The grand manor behind her felt like a beautifully decorated mausoleum. She turned to Silas, who stood quietly beside her on the wooden decking, his chest completely healed, his stormy eyes reflecting a profound, hard-won peace. She knew exactly what she had to do. Eleanor did not reclaim the bloody throne. Instead, she summoned the territorial lawyers and systematically dismantled the Vance empire from the inside out. She sold the massive tracts of land at a fraction of their value directly to the very people Elias had violently displaced. She ensured Joseph and the surviving families of the immigrant settlement received prime acreage and the necessary capital to build a lasting, honest community where they would never again fear the sound of approaching hooves in the dark. She liquidated the remaining assets, packing the modest, honest sum into a single canvas saddlebag. She chose to walk away from a legacy built entirely on suffering, opting to forge a completely new destiny on her own uncompromising terms. They packed a single freight wagon and rode west, leaving the bitter memories of the Wyoming territory behind them in the dust. The long, arduous journey took them across the towering, jagged spines of the Rocky Mountains and down into the lush, untrammeled valleys of the Oregon Territory. Here, the land was wild and untouched by the greedy hands of railroad barons, corrupt marshals, and scheming politicians. Massive stands of ancient pine and fragrant cedar blanketed the rolling hills, and crystal-clear rivers cut deeply through the fertile earth. They purchased a modest, secluded plot of untamed land nestled securely in the bend of a quiet river. There were no servants, no grand staircases, and no sprawling, violent empires to manage. Together, they swung the heavy steel axes, felling the massive timber to build a sturdy, simple cabin with their own hands. The daily labor was grueling, blistering their skin and testing their physical endurance. But every swing of the hammer was a profound act of creation, a definitive rejection of the destruction that had previously defined their lives. Silas traded his heavy repeating rifles for an iron plow, turning the rich, dark soil to plant wheat and corn. The haunting, suffocating nightmares of the Civil War battlefields and his burning homestead slowly faded into the past, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of the changing seasons and the gentle, constant presence of the woman who had pulled him back from the absolute edge of the abyss. Eleanor, the former high society aristocrat who had nearly frozen to death in a ruined mourning dress, learned to bake heavy bread over an open stone hearth and tend to a small, thriving flock of sheep. Her hands were permanently calloused, her face bronzed by the western sun, and she had never possessed a greater, more radiant beauty. One late autumn evening, as a cool breeze swept down from the distant, snow-capped peaks, Eleanor and Silas sat together on the rough-hewn porch of their cabin. The valley before them was bathed in the warm, golden light of the setting sun, casting long, peaceful shadows across their harvested fields. Silas reached out, his thick, scarred hand gently enveloping hers. There was absolutely no need for grand declarations or dramatic, sweeping vows. The profound, enduring love they shared was forged in the darkest, most terrifying corners of the world, tempered by fire, and completely unbreakable. They had been cast aside by their own kin, hunted by ruthless killers, and entirely broken by a cruel, unforgiving world, but they had steadfastly refused to surrender. They had fought their way through the absolute worst of human nature to find an honest, quiet redemption in each other's arms. They looked out over the land they had tamed together, breathing in the deep, comforting scent of wood smoke and pine. The ghosts of their past would always remain a part of their history, a solemn reminder of the price of their freedom. But those ghosts no longer dictated their future. Here, at the very edge of the map, far from the greed and the bloodshed, they had finally built an impenetrable sanctuary. They had found their home. Thank you for riding along on this brutal, unforgettable journey into the heart of the unforgiving West. If the story of Eleanor and Silas moved you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this tale with anyone who appreciates a gritty, character-driven Western. I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Leave the word resilience, so I know you stood by them until the very end. And do not forget to hit the hype button, so this video can reach more viewers who crave authentic, emotionally raw stories of the untamed frontier.